Hello, and welcome to episode 22 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're joined today by David Gleason, a Philadelphia-based artist, and Mary Mihelic, a New York and Chicago-based artist. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So the first question I'd like to ask the both of you today is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Well, we're here specifically about this art project we've created, which is a comment on Donald Trump. We're sitting inside what was his original and first campaign bus. We're both artists, and we both work in political and social realms with our artwork. And this was an irresistible opportunity to really see how important art can be in the presidential landscape. Mm-hmm. And we've been at this really for about a year, even before the primaries started. Mm-hmm. And we've purchased his campaign bus off of Craigslist for $14,000, and we have created a variety of anti-Trump artwork around it.
And as far as the history of activism with me goes,
so what's motivating you guys? I know that you have jobs, you try to work as artists in the economy, you have personal lives in Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and yet you're traveling around the country. You made a personal investment financially of $14,000, but also for the past year, you've been investing of yourselves, your time, your energy. You're not financially remunerated for your efforts. What drives you to stand out in the cold, to go to cities, to engage individuals in conversation? What is it that really makes you give your time and your effort and your treasure?
Well, I think when things really shock and appall me, I tend to make art about them or get involved. And I think there's 3 times in my life I think that's been significant. Mm-hmm. Once was when the homelessness started in Boston in the late 80s. Mm-hmm. All the homeless started to emerge, so I became very involved with the homeless for about a decade.
Why did that begin happening?
That was the end of when all of that was just part of the cycle of the end of Reaganism, and a lot of the mental health facilities were closed down, and a lot of the homelessness were found on the street then. There were tons of women with children. The women were disguising themselves as men at that point to get into homeless shelters because there were none for women. So a woman named Kip Tiernan founded the first homeless shelter for women in the United States. And that was in Boston. It was called Rosie's Place. So I started becoming involved in that. And I think it's just because I'm touched, and I just feel like if something really touches you, it's your job as a human being to go out and do something about it, to try and make a difference in any way you can. Mm-hmm. I would say that the next significant thing was the kidnapped schoolgirls in Nigeria a couple years ago. When they were kidnapped, I was just so appalled and horrified that I started making art about that, kind of to raise awareness about global feminism and education for women around the world. Mm-hmm. And then when Trump started just behaving and running for president, I just looked at who was going to be representing our country. And I just felt as an artist, I had to speak out and use my artistic voice to speak out against Trump. And I wish more artists would use their voice to speak out against what they believe in. Because imagine if Trump was running for president and no one spoke out against him. Mm-hmm. That would just be horrific. So we're using our voices to speak out against some of the things he says.
Yeah, I think with respect to public interest, we think that art has a great role to play, and it may be underestimated in the political realm especially. I tend to work in areas of economics and politics because that tends to be my other background. And I've always been moved by Václav Havel, who was one of the great leaders of the battle against communism, who became the Czech president. He was originally a playwright and a poet. And he said if we are to change our worldview, images must change. Artists have a very important job to do. They're not just out there entertaining rich people. They have to get involved. And I think I try to take that to heart. And in this case, was very clearly, I thought, an opportunity to try and help the public sphere and the level of dialogue and the way people thought about how to respond to some of these things.
So let's talk a little bit about the current piece of art, both the bus and the flag. If you could describe a little bit what your current art installation is, if that's what you would describe it as, and some of the reactions you've elicited and any regional variation you've experienced in reaction to the art that you've made.
All right. Well, the bus is Donald Trump's old campaign bus. So it said Trump, make America great again on both sides of the bus when we purchased it. We operate under the name T. Rut, which is after the way Marcel Duchamp signed his famous urinal Armat. And we had been operating under that name for a couple years. So when we got the bus, the first thing we did was add a dot between the T and the R and make it T-Rump. And then because we were so offended by Trump's comments about Megyn Kelly in the first debate, we put make fruit punch great again on one side, which is a reference to blood, and the other side we put woman Trump Trump. And so those were the first changes we made to the bus, and then it's kind of evolved as an art installation. Like now in the back it has a comment that says birthed in the USA, and on Earth Day we added save water, only waterboard on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We have Trump's tagline in Arabic on the back, art installations inside, and so we do performances around the bus as well.
Yeah, we've waterboarded the bus. We kicked that off in South Carolina in front of the Citadel, which is the famous military college in Charleston. And we take a huge rope, we tie the bus down with 2 big cinder blocks on either side, and we drape a cloth across the nose of the bus, and I get up on the roof and with a 5-gallon jug of water just dribble water down the front of the bus. And for us it actually gets quite emotional sometimes. First off, it just seems like a horrific process to be waterboarded. Mary knew more about waterboarding than I did because of her work with the Boko Haram, protesting against them with her art. But we also have a performance where I get up at Trump rallies and swing a golf club up on top of the bus, which is kind of a fun way to get people engaged, but it's really a very serious comment about Trump's character, because apparently he's one of the most notorious cheaters on the golf course. And people like Samuel Jackson, the actor, had gotten a big row with him early in the process of Trump's campaign. Famous commentator from ESPN said on a scale of 1 to 10, when it comes to cheating at golf, Trump is an 11. So, we've tried to find things that are engaging and humorous and very visual, because ultimately, art is a combination of emotion and visual expression. And that is something that even the very early days, when we allowed people to throw fruit punch up on the side of the bus to stain the Trump letters, that was an effort to kind of just let people get that expression physically out there, because so much of politics and the way campaigning and messaging occurs is really very abstract, and it's not terribly physical at all. It's become it's just much too cerebral and emotional, and you don't get that physical expression. So art is inevitably a physical act at the core. So those are a couple of the things that we do.
And then this summer we wear high-vis yellow clothing, mostly because the bus has 1,000,000 miles on it and it breaks down a lot on the side of the road. So we bought a high-vis yellow coat for practical purposes so we wouldn't get run over. And then we realized that we should just kind of make that our color when we're around the bus. And that way people, when we're a little bit away from the bus, know that we're with the bus and they'll talk to us. And so I was sewing like a high-vis yellow outfit this summer or in the spring. And I thought about sewing, and then I started thinking about American history, and I started thinking about Betsy Ross. And that brought me to this idea of sewing Donald Trump quotes in high-vis yellow on American flags. So David and I talked about it, and we decided to put a sewing machine on the bus and open up the windows and embroider quotes onto American flags. So we started doing that in the spring, and we started doing that in front of the Betsy Ross house in Philadelphia on like 3-foot by 5-foot flags. And then we were in California in some old antique flea market-y kind of store, and we found a really old vintage 10-foot by 15-foot flag. And we held on to it, and we're talking about what quote should go on that flag forever. And then a couple weeks ago, Donald Trump opened his mouth with the hot mic quote that had grab him by the ... on it. And that was like, oh, thank you, Donald. Now we know what we're putting on that flag. And now we actually, it's enormous. The flag is enormous, and we are going to go, we stand outside early voting places with it, and we met you in D.C. clearly in front, and we've been in front of the White House here with it. So we'll be in front of early voting locations holding up that flag tomorrow. And tomorrow we'll also be in front of the Trump's making an appearance in Washington, D.C. here, so we'll be outside of that. So we also do that kind of thing.
So what are some of the reactions that you've experienced from individuals who've seen the flag, and then how have those varied in different locations around the country?
Well, we do. Usually, the people who react most strongly to the flag are Trump supporters, and we should make it clear. Most of the time we go to Trump rallies, so we kind of go right behind the lines.
And are you guys Trump supporters?
We are definitely not Trump supporters.
Okay.
So we find ourselves stuck in the middle between protesters and Trump people, and both of them have a strong reaction to the bus right away. The flags, it's fascinating to me. I think this was Mary's piece, and I just think it's brilliant because we do actually come straight forward and call it the whole piece desecration. And we know that working with the flag artistically has even been a legal issue in the past. And we've researched it, and to the best of our research and knowledge, it was upheld by the Supreme Court that it is legal to use the flag in other forms of expression and to work on the flag. And
as artists.
but we still get often.
And that was a Supreme Court decision?
That was a Supreme Court decision that's interesting because it was about, I think, a decade ago only, and it was one vote off.
Right.
So
a 21st century Supreme Court decision about the use of an American flag by artists, by all 9 members, and it won in a 5-4 split vote.
Correct.
You're saying? Okay.
And it enables artists to use the flag for artistic purposes to make a statement.
Interesting.
Yes, and it doesn't expand beyond the artistic expression clause from what we read. I mean, we really researched it because we are protesters,
Right.
and we would rather not go to jail. But we were in front of the White House yesterday, and the Secret Service told us something interesting, which is 2 people do not make a protest. So we actually never have to apply for protest permits as only 2 people.
Now, are there any other individuals who travel with you in the bus?
No.
No, not really.
Okay, we have guests sometimes.
Yeah.
How did you guys get connected to each other?
Well, we have an old friend in common who Mary knew. I used to live in New York years ago. He was living in New York still. They were friends, and then I was looking for a place to do a show in New York about 3 years ago.
An art show.
An art show, yep,
Okay.
an art show. And we hadn't really been in touch, but I emailed you, I think, from Kenya. I was traveling, and asked if Mary might have some ideas for a way to do a show. So that's how we started to actually work together as artists.
So have these have there been any positive externalities from your volunteer activism here? Meaning, have you gotten some interest in other forms of art that you've been offering for sale in other venues unrelated to your political activism?
A bit. But let me just answer the flag question a little bit more thoroughly.
Sure.
Because when we go to protests, we get in amazing conversations with veterans.
Yeah.
With people who feel very strongly about the flag.
Yeah.
We've even, we had 2 young guys who were Afghan vets. They had huge AK-47s on their shirts with, I am an NRA voter.
Yeah.
And they were the most even-headed young men, probably in their mid-20s.
Trump supporters.
They said, look, I don't fully agree with what you're doing, but we fought for your rights to do this on the flag. And honestly, these are some amazing moments. And some of the other amazing moments are the people who are really worried and concerned about us using the flag. And then we'll ask a Trump supporter, are there any quotes of Donald Trump you'd like to see us sew on the flag?
And they give us quotes.
Really?
So it really gets at this moment where it's like, wow, we have really pushed this into this realm in a way that gets people to have to reconcile a variety of uncomfortable things.
So it sounds like you have really strong political opinions or positions, and yet you're seeking to engage in dialogue those who have different opinions.
We believe in peaceful dialogue, and we think that's our frustration with a lot of the protesters. It's hard for me to stand there and watch people screaming across the street at each other because they're not accomplishing anything, and I would only imagine how frustrating that would be as a protester to go home after just yelling all night and never actually having real dialogue. So one art critic called the bus at one point a Trojan horse because it still has that Trump brand look on it, and if you don't read it, you just see Trump, where it sucks in the Trump supporters and they get all excited and they come over thinking maybe Trump's on the bus or it's a Trump bus, and then they get a little closer and they might read it or talk to us and they realize it's the opposite of what they thought, and you can completely watch their expressions change, and they get really kind of disappointed. Sometimes they get frustrated, and then I'd say until recently, 90% of the time they burst out laughing. And then we can engage in a fun way about Donald Trump. So from my perspective as an artist, it's really hard to change someone's emotion in an artwork.
Yeah.
And if you can change their emotion, that shows you can change their thinking. And if you can change their thinking, then there's some possibility to change their vote. So that's kind of the metaphor for the whole process of the bus to me, and I think that's really important. When we unveiled the large flag that had Trump's hot mic comment on it, most people aren't aware of the first sentence of that comment, which has been not shown anywhere, which says, "I did try and, swear word her." And so the flag says that in huge letters. And so most people stop and just stare at it. We unveiled it at the Trump rally, and we were nervous. We made sure there were a lot of cops around, and we went to the protesters first just to see how they would react, and they were just cheering and offering us money, which has never happened before.
Yeah,
They
gas
were throwing money at us.
These were Trump or
the Trump protesters.
Trump protesters.
And then we walked by the Trump supporters, and for the first time, they were speechless. I mean, they were shocked because of the size of the flag. They couldn't really argue it. And so they were just really shocked. And I think now for the Trump supporters, that quote is has a lot of sadness to them, because I think they realize it's the end of his ability to win. So I think that particular quote has some emotion that is associated with like disappointment for the Trump supporters, and they can't really argue it. So they were just silent.
And just to give a visual for our listeners, this is a large American flag, and in the white bars, they have neon yellow tennis ball lettering, a varying font size that tells the quote about Donald Trump's interactions with women that recently became available on YouTube and through news reports. And so there's a big American flag with lettering, the quote, written in the white bars across the flag.
Yeah, it's and I think just to maybe try and tackle the big question of kind of art in the public interest, which seems to be a question you're asking, is that that is a real specific example of how we're trying to address some of the imperfections in the way that dialogue has unfolded in this race. And I think that could be imaginable in any political realm, or even when there's a referendum at stake in a local civic question or something like that, that the need to really think about the way images and what people say fits within the context of what we're trying to achieve in a civil society, let's imagine. The abstraction of it all, the nature of conversation, as we've seen, conversation can just go on and on and on and not necessarily arrive anywhere. The idea that we could get Trump supporters to basically stop dead in their tracks and be speechless was a really wonderful moment for us, just as when we see people make that emotional flip when they think the bus is either pro-Trump and then they get worried, they get concerned and disappointed, or they think it's pro-Trump and then they get happy if they're a protester. And so I think kind of that art in the public interest is a big part of it for us. I also think, for me, I try to get at the difference between art and science. I think as a modern society, we are very beholden to science and imagining that science is going to cure all of our problems. And I just do not believe that's true. I think science is as susceptible to imperfection as anything in the social realm, because ultimately most decisions that get made and supported that come out of academia or science or corporations are packed with and driven by another agenda that is inherently social. It's a group of people who want to believe that something is worth pushing forward. It happens in physics, and I feel as though in medicine it's a big issue. And art is the other end of the spectrum about how we understand the world, especially social issues. And inherently politics and economics are social beasts. And Mary's work about the Boko Haram, I think, was just fantastic, because it even pulls in that hugely powerful religious issue that is so subject to manipulation and real control. And I must say, for me, almost every sphere we just discussed is dominated by men. And I think as a man, I'm a little sick of the men's club. And I think when you look at the landscape and you imagine, gee, what could we do in this country to improve the way we're attacking all kinds of issues, I think the better empowerment of women in that across the spectrum would be a huge leap forward, and breaking down those barriers is important. So ultimately we hoped maybe Trump would drop out of the race and a woman would emerge out of the Republican side. I always like Meg Whitman. She built up eBay, she runs Hewlett Packard, she's smart, she's a common sense Republican, but here we're stuck with Donald Trump. And it's just so sad for the Republicans.
You hit on something that I find quite interesting. A lot of policy discussion, a lot of politics is driven by policy discussions, especially from the party establishment. But oftentimes the decision a voter makes at the poll is generally driven by emotions. And when you juxtaposed American science and American art, I almost felt you juxtaposing American logos and American pathos. And I wonder if you could comment on kind of the emotion, the tug, the pull and the push of the interactions between emotions and logical reasoning on the campaign trail, and how your work has played into emotions and logic.
Do you want to go on that?
I have to think about that for a second. I mean, that's exactly what we do. We play with that emotional logic. That's the power of Trump's brand.
Mm-hmm.
We drive down the street, and every minute we get either a honk and someone gives us the finger, or someone gives us the fist pump. If they know about the bus, they tend to give us a peace sign.
Yeah, right.
But every minute, and we get frustrated because people don't read, and it is all about the power of the Trump brand. People hate him so much right now, and their emotions are so strong, or they love him so much. It doesn't matter what he says or what he does, they are going to make that vote for him. You would say to them, but he said he was going to do this, and they say, oh, he won't do that. Like,
He
they don't
doesn't really
believe the
mean it.
words that
Yeah.
come out of his mouth. He doesn't mean it. And yet they completely call Hillary a liar all the time. So it's kind of fascinating. Like, sometimes there's just no way to navigate or change that emotion. And there's nothing rational about it
Mm-hmm.
at all.
And yeah, I would say, kind of to the pathos and logos question, which is that look how central polls are to the entire political dialogue. And that's this whole notion that statistical analysis will lead us down the path to understanding what's going to happen. But there becomes a real kind of interdependency problem when people start to use polls that ultimately they start to shape the way they think about things. And you saw that really happen in the Republican primary, and we're seeing it happen now. And so that's kind of the scientific side of the politics, the effort to try and apply logical, rational methods to understand political decision making. And then on the other hand, there's this intense emotional thing going on with probably the most emotional candidate we've seen in decades, Donald Trump. And how he is just stoking it left, right, and center. And so I think there is that dichotomy. I think one thing, just to get a little bit more esoteric, Mary and I are both interested conceptually in the nature of time. And this push-pull that you used, you're kind of using your hands to push-pull between those two, is very much, I think, how we all move through time. And the question of, is time really long and distant, or is the way we experience our lives and the world something that happens really very much in the moment? And in the moment, we're always at a struggle between, well, what's logical? What do I think is going to happen? What have I seen happen before? And versus what do I feel and what do I want to perhaps have happen? And those things are kind of trying to dance together and figure out how we make decisions and ultimately what happens. And that's the way a good political system should work. That's the way a good economy and markets should work. It's probably the way a good religion should work too. The idea that it has to be flexible in the moment. So that gets us into a little bit of a different realm, but I think that logic and emotion play themselves out very much in the present, and that's always a bit of a challenge.
So David and Mary, I'll let you have one last thing, but we are coming towards the end of our podcast now. So I'll let you say what you're going to say, and then I'd like to ask both of you to just comment on the nature of your work and your passion, and whether it be through the homeless shelters in Boston or Boko Haram, or your work engaging those who are different than you around the country. What really motivates you to work to advance the public interest, even at personal expense? So please, with your comment, or answer the question as your preference.
Well, I'll start with a comment because I need a minute to think about the question. The fear, I think that Donald Trump's really, run his campaign based on fear. And that's his strategy for getting votes. And I think the campaign's lost a lot of humor, and so what the bus also is doing is using humor to reach people as an emotion.
You mentioned surprise and humor. Right.
Yeah. So it's more about kind of core motivation, really?
Exactly. Why are you doing this? As individuals, David and Mary, what's driving you?
Well, I think that I'm motivated a lot by just spiritual things, and it's the spirit and my intuition. So what happens is I just feel something, and then I go in that direction. I feel like there's a spirit or an intuition guiding me there. So with the homeless situation, I was so appalled, I just had to get involved. And then I felt that way when the schoolgirls were kidnapped. Like something told me to make art about that. And then when Trump started running, it was just, this bus kind of just fell out of the sky in our hands. And to me, it was like a gift. Like you have to take those moments and seize them and just use your voice to speak out against things. So I don't know that I have a strategic approach, but I listen to my intuition and I listen to like the spiritual life inside me, and I follow that as my guide.
Yeah, for me, there was a personal moment a couple of years ago, I guess, where I had been working on the show about the financial system, and it was a big show and it had a lot of different parts, and it was and I started to think about the way that artists have been treated in the past, and had used that Havel quote as part of that show, and then I started to think about when in these kind of tyrannical situations, often the first people that get pushed to the side or shut down are artists. When you think about what Hitler did, the degenerate art movement, and the notion that art was this dangerous thing, the Taliban blowing up the beautiful statues, and to me that became a really powerful moment. And it was actually here on the banks of the Potomac. I was walking in 20-degree weather, and I had this moment where I thought, wow, this must be partly what Havel's talking about. And so then a year later, I'm on vacation, and Trump is a complete nut in his first debate. And clearly, I have known a few people who worked with the guy in the past, and I had spent enough time in New York over the years. He's really out there. He's kind of an emotional train wreck, I think. And it became clear that, wow, this is a moment where art is going to have to be somehow present. And so I didn't know what direction it would go in. We didn't know what we would do with this bus when we bought it. I'm more of a raw materials guy. I like to have different materials around me so that I can get used to them and figure out what I'm going to do with them, and that's what this bus became. And so that was, I think, for me, a core motivation.
Well, thank you. So really, you heard it from David and Mary that art is about self-expression and about sometimes bridging emotional and reason and emotions, and reaching out to individuals to create dialogue. Art can be visual, it can be verbal, it can manifest itself in many forms, but one motivation for Mary and David is to inspire dialogue and to create social change. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been episode 22 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.